Welcome, everybody. I actually resonated with what Eric Metaxas said this morning about meaning, crisis of meaning, because that was what brought me to faith. I was a senior, all this pressure to get into a good college, and I had no idea why I was on the planet. And I was searching for meaning, and God brought me a teacher who was a fairly new Christian herself, and gave me some things to read, and brought me to faith, for which I got actually quite choked up walking back there today, looking at the room. I just want to mention quickly, we've left some brochures out there on the table. There were a few also in the auditorium, but do pick one up if you want to know more about Libri.
They're on the front table.
They're on the front table now, okay. If you're interested in coming to see us, we love having people come. I'm also going to mention now, because I will otherwise forget, is that InterVarsity approached me to publish a booklet quite a few years ago based on a lecture that I'd done on Are Christianity and Feminism Compatible, was the name of the lecture, and they published this little booklet, Feminism in the Bible. It's out of print, but I do have some copies. So if anyone's interested in the end, you can give me $1 and I'll give you a booklet. But I know I'd forget if I didn't say it now, so. Okay, so we're talking about liberty and justice for women with a question mark. When I was growing up in the 1950s, we began every school day by reciting this pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. I don't know if that still happens in all public schools. It does in my granddaughter in Georgia. They still do. Our republic was founded in the name of liberty and justice against what the colonists experience as unfair British control without representation. Most simply, liberty is freedom from unwanted control and freedom to come and go and make choices for yourself. Justice most basically means fairness. You may be wondering why my title, Liberty and Justice for Women, ends with a question mark. And the reason is because women were just one of the groups, undoubtedly the largest, included in the all, who in fact were substantially denied liberty and justice from the beginning of our nation. The liberty and justice women have in America today did not come easily. They were hard won by the costly work, particularly of first wave feminists, and also I would say second wave feminists. And the work is not finished. The Me Too movement has made this fact abundantly clear. Starting in 2017, women from every racial, economic, socioeconomic, political, and religious background started speaking up about their experiences of sexual harassment, assault, and blatant workplace discrimination. Their offenders were men with power on the right and on the left in every conceivable workplace, including the church, and not only the Catholic Church. The Southern Baptist Convention is dealing right now with totally credible evidence of large-scale sexual abuse of young people over many years. It's not surprising that the events of 2017 raised many Americans' consciousness of and curiosity about feminism, which probably explains the fact that Webster Dictionary's top searched for term of 2017 was feminism. And it was their choice for word of the year. Feminism has never been a unified movement, and it is less unified today than ever. Some feminist values and goals overlap substantially with Christian values and goals, and others are openly anti-Christian. But whatever your associations with the word feminism, it is undeniable that without the voices of feminists, the victims of predatory males would still be silent. And some justice has resulted in ending the careers of many of the offending men. Oops, wrong one. Here. This is my outline. In this lecture, I will be considering why 19th century feminism happened. And my main focus will be on American history. The women's rights movement that began in the 19th century was not initially described with the term feminism, but in the aftermath of several so-called waves of feminism, those early women's rights activists are now called first wave feminists. And I will be referring to them mostly as early feminists, in contrast to several waves of modern feminists, so later feminists. You may not realize that a large percentage of early feminists were Christians. and even those who were not, shared moral goals which were consistent with biblical Christianity. The same cannot be said for all the feminisms which have followed. But to understand why early feminism happened, we have to go way back and consider the long history of what I call the abuse of gender difference. So, my first section here will be, or the second here, the abuse of gender difference in the West. Starting back with the Greeks, gender discussion centered almost exclusively on difference. Woman was different, and that meant inferior to the male human norm. According to the Greeks, all evil and hardship originated with woman. In about 700 BC, the poet Hesiod wrote that Zeus designed the first woman, Pandora, as a curse on men. She, quote, lifted in her hands the great lid from the jar, and scattered evils about. She devised miserable sorrows, harsh labor, and cruel diseases for men. And from her descended the cursed race, the tribe of women, close quote. The myth of Pandora was the accepted explanation for the origin of evil in the world. But in the words of the classicist Eva Contarella, it was Aristotle who in the 4th century BC, quote, definitively locked women in the circle of their so-called natural difference. And his influence in Western culture cannot be overestimated, both inside and outside the Christian church. For Aristotle, the differences between men and women were absolute and all-encompassing. In fact, men and women had nothing in common, basically, for Aristotle. According to him, men and women have different origins and natures, different virtues, different roles, different rules, different work, and different spheres. The sexes were truly opposite, and difference meant hierarchy. As Aristotle put it, the male is by nature superior, and the female inferior. The one rules and the other is ruled. There was nothing remotely mysterious about gender to Aristotle. It was crystal clear and permanently fixed by nature, biology, or the gods. As the early church fathers were classically educated, they often expressed an unholy mixture of biblical thinking and classical Greek thinking about gender. Aristotle's ideas also shaped Thomas Aquinas and influenced the Protestant reformers. I'm just going to give you a very few examples. There are many more. 4th century Augustine, these are people that I'm really grateful for, I will say that. I'm very thankful for Augustine, Luther, Calvin, and so on, but they had some blind spots. 4th century Augustine wrote, the woman together with her own husband is the image of God. But the woman herself alone is not the image of God in the way that the man alone is. Augustine, Tertullian, and other church fathers blamed Eve alone for the fall. Tertullian wrote, you are the devil's gateway, the image of God, the man Adam, you broke him. You deserved death, and it was the Son of God who had to die. Aquinas consciously tried to combine Aristotle and the Bible, and Aristotle won in his view of woman as a misbegotten male, inferior in body, mind, and virtue, whose only role is procreative. John Calvin wrote that women are in the image of God in an inferior degree. Men are preferred to females in the human race. And Martin Luther wrote, Satan attacks human nature where it is weakest, Eve, the woman. For Adam was the more excellent creature, even when nature was still perfect. Close quote. Not only in theology and literature, but in painting and sculpture, Western art assaults us with images that identify man with God and woman with Satan. So here is Lucas Cranach's painting of Paradise, which depicts God as an old man. And then this next picture shows the next part. Satan as a fair-haired female snake, the mirror image of Eve. Satan in the tree. Definitely a female. Michelangelo's Temptation in the Sistine Chapel depicts Satan as half serpent, half woman. And the west facade of Notre Dame Cathedral depicts a female serpent tempting Adam and Eve. This one's amazing. She even has breasts. Clearly, it's breasts. And these works and many others the biblical story has been changed to resemble the Greek myth of Pandora. Woman is to blame for the fall. Whether in theology, art, or general culture, the majority voice proclaimed that gender difference meant female moral and intellectual inferiority and subordination, and the right of men to define women's roles and deny their liberty and justice. And now I want to skip a few hundred years and cross the Atlantic to an early chapter in the history of our nation. John Adams, the second president of the United States, was a member of the committee drafting the Declaration of Independence. His wife, Abigail, wrote him a letter in 1776 urging him, quote, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Is that familiar? The unlimited power of husbands over wives was a reference to the English common law tradition which the Puritans brought with them to the colonies. The law of coverture read, quote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything." Close quote. A femme couverte, or a covered woman, had no civic identity. She could not own or acquire property. She could not enter into a contract or write a will. She could not buy, sell, or trade. Since you had to own property to participate in the political system, women were by definition excluded from politics. In cases of divorce, husbands gained child custody. By law, a husband could physically punish his wife. Colonial court records indicate that violent husbands were frequently prosecuted by early Puritan New England. In the colonies, Christian principles were meant to restrain a husband from exercising his legal rights, but clearly that did not always happen. This is the history behind Abigail Adams' request for her husband to be more favorable to the ladies than his ancestors. If you think about it, it was a radical request because she was asking that the laws be changed so that the happiness and safety of women could be protected against their husbands, who could otherwise continue to legally oppress them and make their lives miserable. Abigail's warning that the ladies would rebel if they continued to be bound by laws in which they had no representation was an obvious reference to the young colonies' revolt against Britain. It could also be seen as an unwitting prediction of first-wave feminism. John Adams responded to Abigail's request dismissively. He wrote, "I cannot but laugh." And he referenced children, apprentices, students, Indians, and slaves, all chafing against those in authority over them. Then he wrote, quote, "But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, have grown discontented. Depend on it, we men know better than to repeal our masculine systems." Close quote. In practice, John and Abigail Adams' marriage was an early example of what scholars call companionate marriage. It was characterized by mutual affection, friendship, and deep respect. So even though Abigail was still, by law, a femme couverte, John Adams did not abuse his legal power over her. But not all wives were so blessed. The men who shaped the American Republic, back to my outline. The men who shaped the American Republic after the war were well aware that two institutions, slavery and marriage, contradicted the egalitarian principles of the Revolution. The self-evident truth that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They realized slavery and marriage were not being respected in that way, but they kept slavery and marriage in place. The 19th century French novelist and playwright Honoré de Balzac expressed a common justification for what John Adams called the masculine systems which denied women liberty and justice. De Balzac wrote, "Pay no attention to woman's murmurs, her cries, her pains. Nature has made her for our use and for bearing everything, children, sorrows, blows, and pains inflicted by men. Do not accuse yourself of hardness. In all the codes of civilized nations, man has written the laws that ranged woman's destiny under this bloody epigraph, Vae victis, woe to the weak," close quote. Balzac and many others argued from nature, from women's physical vulnerability, and from the law for the right of the stronger to brutalize the weaker. I want to look now at the Christian and Enlightenment roots of early feminism. Early feminism was born out of the evangelical social reform movements that flowed from the Second Great Awakening and from the Enlightenment commitment to the premise that all men, including women, are created equal. While Enlightenment thinkers included Christians and non-Christians, the conviction of human equality came from the Judeo-Christian biblical understanding of creation, as Dick argued so strongly in the last workshop. As Enlightenment principles were applied to gender relations, they unleashed an international debate about the place of women both in marriage and in the Republic. The model of marriage as a miniature monarchy, with husband having absolute authority over all household members, was undermined. Mary Astle asked, "If absolute sovereignty be not necessary in a state, how comes it to be so in a family?" She answered her own question, that absolute rule was more mischievous in families than in kingdoms, by exactly the same amount as 100,000 tyrants are worse than one. Radical thinkers argued that marriage should be based on love and reason between equals in the pursuit of happiness, rather than on a husband's arbitrary will. Influenced by Quaker lawmakers, the state of New Jersey actually granted women the right to vote 2 days after the Declaration of Independence. Conservatives were horrified, and in 1807, New Jersey revoked women's short-lived right to vote. Some argued against the innate intellectual inferiority of women and for a world without sex-linked restrictions in education, occupation, dress, or conversation. Women's colleges began to be founded in the mid-19th century to give women access to higher education. This was at a time when rigorous study was believed not only to be unnecessary, but actually unhealthy for women. Medical texts and how it would ruin their ability to have children if they studied, if they went to college. The 18th century thinkers who endorsed equality of the sexes were in a minority, but they anticipated the 19th century feminist demands for marriage reform and women's rights. And I want to look a little closer now at the evangelical roots of early feminism. The Second Great Awakening of 1795 to 1840 fueled many broad social reform movements, including abolition, women's rights, temperance, and prison reform. While these reform movements drew Christians and non-Christians, religion historian Sidney Alstrom comments that church people, quote, frequently provided the initial impulse and leadership, and nearly all the campaigns were pervaded by appeals to Christian principles. If the collective conscience of evangelical America is left out, the reformist movement as a whole is incomprehensible, unquote. The principal leader behind evangelical social concern was Charles Finney, and he encouraged women's leadership in public speaking and praying in mixed-sex groups. This was very threatening to traditionalists because it implied a new kind of equality between the sexes, which might undermine a husband's authority over his wife. Between 1800 and 1850, thousands of evangelical social reform movements were formed, which were dependent on the active, public, influential leadership of women. Speaking of these women, the feminist leader Lydia Child noted in 1841 that their, quote, prodigious influence and consequent responsibility have transformed the household utensil into a living, energetic being, and there is no spell to turn it back into a broom again. Close quote. Evangelical suffrage leaders Anna Shaw, Frances Willard, who was the founder of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and others felt God leading them to fight for women's vote for the protection of home and family. In 1877, Dwight L. Moody, our very own Dwight L. Moody, asked Willard to work with him in his evangelistic campaign, which she was happy to do. He encouraged her to continue her preaching and public speaking for women's suffrage. An advocate of women's education, Moody started Northfield School for Girls and the Brother School across the river, Mount Hermon, of course, which I attended here, as we mentioned, in the early 60s. In summary, while not all early feminists were Christians, the early feminist movement was inseparable from its evangelical roots. And now I want to introduce you to two sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, the devout Christian daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder. Dick reminds me that pictures in these days, you had to stay very still and you weren't allowed to smile for a long time. But they suffered for their activism, which I'll tell you about. So again, they were the devout Christian daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder. In 1836, they began speaking in public and writing against the evils of slavery and about the equality of the sexes. In Angelina's appeal to the Christian women of the South, she argued from Scripture for women to fear God rather than wicked human laws and do their part to overthrow slavery. That document is really powerful. Look it up. I don't have time to give you more quotes, but it's an amazing document. In 1837, Sarah Grimke wrote Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women, in which she critiqued many systemic injustices, including the wage discrimination, which valued the labor of men more highly than the labor of women, and the pressure on women to hide their intellects in order to allure men. And she wrote with, quote, the deepest shame and sorrow about the tide of pollution over our southern cities because of the rape of female slaves who are bought and sold to, quote, gratify the brutal lust of those who bear the name of Christian, close quote. Sarah Grimke protested the false translations of some biblical passages by men to justify the abuse of gender difference. The Grimke sisters' pamphlets sold widely in the North, but were burned in their home city of Charleston, and they were threatened with imprisonment if they ever returned to South Carolina. They were victims of mob violence, and the Philadelphia building in which Angelina was delivering an address was stoned and burned. Ironically, the building had been constructed as a monument to free speech. These kind of attacks cost Angelina her health. In 1837, the General Association of Massachusetts Churches wrote a pastoral letter warning the Grimke sisters against the, quote, dangers threatening the female character that came from public speaking. The, quote, modesty of the female sex demanded unostentatious private efforts to advocate the cause of religion and reform. But when she assumes the place and tone of a man as a public reformer, her character becomes unnatural, unquote. The pastors especially deplored the, quote, intimate acquaintance and promiscuous conversation of females with regard to things which ought not to be named. In other words, the rape of slave women. By naming this terrible abuse of power, the Grimke sisters were accused of opening the way for degeneracy and ruin. Sarah began her response to the pastoral letter with Scripture. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Of whom shall I be afraid? She accused them of drawing, these pastors, Massachusetts pastors, of drawing an anti-scriptural distinction between men and women, and she argued that in fulfilling one of the important moral duties laid on her as an accountable being, quote, her character, instead of being unnatural, is in exact accordance with the will of the God to whom and to no other she is responsible for the talents and the gifts confided in her, unquote. She signed off with the words, thine in the bonds of womanhood, Sarah M. Grimke. The term feminist was not used until about 1910, but the Grimke sisters' passions and commitments overlapped substantially with what is now known as first wave feminism. And we'll now briefly consider that movement. Early feminism was a response to the history of the abuse of gender difference. It was born out of a suspicion of the taken for granted status quo of what was considered normal, natural, and God-ordained in the area of gender relations. The immediate impetus for the first Women's Rights Convention came when Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott attended the 1840 World Anti-Slavery Convention in London and were denied seats and voting rights because they were women. So they returned home and started planning the first Women's Rights Convention. There's Elizabeth Cady Stanton when she was younger and when she was older. The Seneca Falls Convention was held in 1848 and drew 300 participants. The Declaration of Sentiments, crafted by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was presented. At the time, she was the 33-year-old mother of 3. She later had 4 more children. The document would set the agenda for the women's rights movement for over 100 years. It was carefully modeled after the Declaration of Independence, claiming the self-evident truth that all men and women are created equal. Most of the female participants of the convention were experienced leaders in charitable, reform, religious, and anti-slavery societies. What started in Seneca Falls spread to other cities and became a national movement. And I'll just say a little bit about this Declaration of Sentiments. The arguments for male and female equality came both from the Enlightenment tradition of natural rights and also from the Bible. As stated in the Declaration, quote, resolved that woman is man's equal was intended to be so by the Creator, and the highest good of the race demands that she should be recognized as such. One of the grievances listed was that man has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it is his right to assign to her her sphere of action, when that belongs to her conscience and her God. Like the Grimke sisters, the devout Christians of the movement had no gripe with the Bible, but with male interpretations of the Bible, and they defended women's equality on the basis of biblical exegesis. The following grievances were elaborated in detail. Woman has been denied her inalienable right to the elective franchise. She had no voice in the making of laws. She was deprived of other rights of citizenship. She was declared civilly dead upon marriage, deprived of her property and wages, discriminated against in cases of divorce and in payment for work. Women were denied equal access to education and were kept out of the professions, held in a subordinate position in church and state, and assigned by men to the domestic sphere. Man has endeavored to destroy woman's self-respect and keep her dependent, close quote. The leaders of the movement saw marriage reform as foundational to women's equality, and I'll mention 2 of many areas of concern. First, the right of husbands to physically punish their wives was still protected by the common law principle of coverture. Alabama became the first state to rescind a husband's legal right to beat his wife, when in 1871, the court declared, quote, the privilege, ancient though it be, to beat her with a stick, to pull her hair, choke her, spit in her face, or kick her about the floor, or to inflict upon her like indignities, is not now acknowledged by our law. The wife is entitled to the same protection of the law that the husband can invoke for himself, close quote. Wife beating is now a criminal offense in every state. To our shame, there is some evangelical teaching which counsels wives to submit to abuse as their wifely duty. This violates Scripture, encourages husbands in law breaking, and shows profound ignorance of the dynamics of marital abuse. The second area of concern also goes back to the principle of coverture, by which married women lost all rights to own property. In 1868, during a debate about granting property rights to married women in England, the London Times expressed a male fear commonly held in the United States as well. So this is from the London Times in 1868. The paper warned that, quote, the proposed change would totally destroy the existing relation between husband and wife. That relation at present is one of authority on the one side and subordination on the other. If a woman has her own property and can apply to her separate use her own earnings, she is in practice emancipated from the control of her husband. What is to prevent her from going where she likes and doing what she pleases? Close quote. It assumes that women are pretty incapable of behaving as responsible adults. Horrors, what if a woman went where she liked and did what she pleased? You couldn't let that happen. The first states to pass the Married Women's Property Act in the United States were Mississippi in 1839 and New York in 1848. Ironically, many male legislators supported these acts in order to protect their married daughters' estates against spendthrift husbands. The Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments ended with an insistence that women have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. But it wasn't until the late 19th century that married women in every state gained the right to own property, and not until 1920 that women got the vote. In the course of the battle for the franchise, arguments for gender difference ended up being as important as arguments for gender sameness. Difference feminists appealed to the 19th century belief in women's moral and religious superiority. They argued that women's votes and influence were needed in the public arena in order to purify and uplift the corrupt male world of politics and business. All early feminists were pro-life. There was a great increase in abortions in the mid-19th century in America. The official feminist position was that men, including selfish husbands, were to blame when a woman resorted to the tragedy of abortion. The early feminist remedy to the problem of unwanted pregnancies was not legalized abortion, but rather the education and enfranchisement of women, which would make abortion unnecessary in a future world of egalitarian respect and sexual discretion. Unquote. Ended up not being quite so simple, has it? Anyway, on to a very brief look at 20th century second and third wave feminisms. Very quick. Many would date the birth of second wave feminism by the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, in 1963. Friedan described the malaise and discontent of many middle-class, homemaking, child-rearing, suburban women suffering from what she called the problem that has no name. A sense of meaninglessness in the midst of material comfort. She described at length a conspiracy of women's magazines and the general culture to define women as anti-intellectual, trivial, solely sexual beings, decorative satellites to their husbands and mothers to their children without a full human identity of their own. Her book resonated with the experience of huge numbers of women who started consciousness-raising groups to meet with other women and share their stories and their frustrations. Second wave feminism began as a movement of educated middle and upper middle class white women. Their initial assumption of a universal sisterhood was soon challenged by black women and working class women asking, exactly who do you consider your sister? Many of these women had experienced discrimination from white feminists, and the race and class difference gave them significantly different priorities, which are now included in essential feminist issues, which were not in the beginning. Second wave feminism went in many directions and includes liberal, Marxist, radical, socialist, psychoanalytic, existentialist, postmodern, neo-pagan, and black feminism or womanism. Second wave feminism brought to light some of the consequences of the male as norm bias, which was still very powerful in the 20th century. For example, they pointed out that history had been literally just that, his story, with women basically invisible. Feminists invented the field of social history, which is largely responsible for telling her story as well. Carol Gilligan's landmark study showed that Lawrence Kohlberg's research on moral development in boys and men was assumed to be normative for all people, and by that standard, girls and women were deemed less morally developed than boys and men. Similarly, the significant disparity between men and women's healthcare treatment was traced in part to the fact that medical research had been done only on men and wrongly assumed to apply equally to women, sometimes with disastrous consequences. Second-wave feminism can be thanked for many of the legal changes which we take for granted today, including greater equality for girls and women in the workplace, in politics, science and technology, the professions, the classroom, and sports, though clearly there's still a ways to go in all these areas. Feminists have raised consciousness about violence against women and children, and they were some of the first to open their homes in costly hospitality to battered women and their children. Second-wave feminism is also inseparable from the sexual revolution. And in 1967, the movement split over abortion rights. Pro-life feminists withdrew from the National Organization for Women when now adopted a Bill of Rights, including what was at the time an extremely controversial call to repeal all abortion laws. Pro-life feminists incorporated as Feminists for Life of America in 1972. And they traced their nonviolent, pro-woman, pro-life feminist roots to their 19th century feminist foremothers, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others. In contrast, mainstream feminists insist that abortion rights are central to women's full equality. Feminists have also been divided over their views on pornography. You can ask about more of this if you want to in discussion. I'm only going to say one sentence about third-wave feminism, and there's some more since then. There's even what they call Twitter feminism today, which I have not followed anyway. Third-wave feminism is postmodern, anything-goes feminism. It has a very conflicted, often antagonistic relationship with earlier feminisms. A book that's a good representative of it is a book called To Be Real by Rebecca Walker, who's the daughter of Alice Walker, the author of
Color Purple.
Thank you, The Color Purple, right. It's very much anything goes feminism. And many older feminists argue that it completely disables, it's politically disabling. It's so much just into desire, particularly sexual desire, my individual sexual desire. It really is politically disabling to feminism. It's not doing anything to improve the culture for women. That's all I'll say about that. Because I want to shift gears now to a biblical perspective on liberty and justice for women. Starting with the origin of gender. Genesis teaches that God created humankind in his image. Male and female, he created them, and he saw that this was very good. This central biblical teaching contrasted radically with the ideas of the culture of the time and continues to give a uniquely powerful basis for the equal value and dignity of every human being. Male and female, young and old, from every race, class, and ethnic group. In Genesis 2, Eve is described as Adam's, quote, equal and adequate or fitting helper. The Hebrew word for helper, ezer, never implies subordination. In the 21 times that it appears in the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, this word ezer almost always refers to God as the mighty helper of his people. The other examples, of which there are just a few, refer to superior military help. So it never applies to subordinate. It's the qualifying word, konegdo, that tells us that the woman was not superior to, but equal to Adam. The word suggests a perfect complementary fit, like two ends of a belt. God also addressed the first man and woman together with what theologians call the cultural mandate, the responsibility for building families and culture, exercising dominion in the world, and caring for creation. God did not say to the man, your job is to lead and initiate, and your sphere is the public world. And he did not say to the woman, your job is to follow, to respond, and support. Your sphere is the private world. So change diapers, cook dinner, and look your best for Adam when he gets home from work. No, God addressed the man and woman together because the complementary contributions of both sexes are needed in every sphere of life, the public and private. The so-called traditionalist adages, which in fact aren't traditional at all, but the so-called traditionalist adages, woman's place is in the home and man is the breadwinner, would have made no sense in biblical times or in any traditional pre-industrial culture, since it was not until the Industrial Revolution that economic work first left the home. In fact, the Greek word used for household in the New Testament comes from the same root as the word economy, because the home was the center of economic work until the Industrial Revolution. In summary, no sexual hierarchy existed at creation when everything was very good. The creational difference between men and women included greater female vulnerability in terms of less physical strength in general and childbearing. But before the fall, the relative power difference between the sexes was not a source of hierarchy, conflict, or abuse. As Francis Schaeffer, the co-founder of Love Read Fellowship, men and women lived in a perfect, unstructured democracy before the fall. So there was a golden age before patriarchy, a question feminists have debated ever since feminism was born. Dorothy Sayers asks, why the opposite sex? Why not the neighboring sex? Well, the biblical drama continues, and rebellion against God begets patriarchy. The problems began in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, where the fall of humanity is described. In contrast to the Greek myth of Pandora, the woman alone did not bring evil into the world. Adam and Eve were together during Satan's temptation. Eve was deceived, and Adam sinned with full knowledge of God's prohibition. They were partners in crime, and both bore consequences of their rebellion, which are described with the same Hebrew word for toil. Human rebellion, sin against the Creator, resulted in many tragic alienations. And Genesis 3:16 specifically predicts a fallen pattern of gender relations. That your desire shall be for the man, and he shall rule over you. In feminist terminology, patriarchy was born. It's crucial to understand this text not as a commandment or prescription from God, but as a tragic description or prediction of a new broken pattern in gender relations, characterized by gender hierarchy, male rule, and a fallen female desire to get and keep a man no matter what the cost. From then on, the greater physical power of men has been foundational to the greater cultural power, and both have too often been used against women. Throughout this lecture, I've referred to this fallen pattern as the abuse of gender difference. This is not to say that women are innocent beings, innocent and unsinful, or something like that. Not at all. It's not to say women are innocent beings, nor that all men are bullies. But the fall led to a well-documented, virtually universal assumption of the male as norm and the female as other and lesser. One of the most horrific examples of the fallen female desire for a man is the common pattern of mothers who know their husbands or boyfriends are sexually abusing their daughters or sons to do nothing. Women sacrifice their children rather than risk losing their men. The sexual abuse is horribly compounded by the complicity of the one who should have been their protector and advocate. In L'Abri, we have had students who have been victims of this, and it's something that's really hard to get over, really hard to get over. Once the fallen male rule of Genesis 3:16 becomes institutionalized, it gains a taken-for-granted reality. It appears self-evident, obvious, normal, natural, needs no justification or proof to the vast majority of people. This is true not only for men, but for most women as well, who will often feel inferior and/or experience intense psychological dissonance. Those exceptional men and women who in any way question the gendered status quo are seen as unnatural and as rebels against God, country, and civilization, even as the Grimke sisters were. I'll give you one other example of that. When the Bronte sisters published their novels, it was considered inappropriate for women to write novels. So they published under the name as the Bell Brothers. So Charlotte Bronte, who wrote Jane Eyre, Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights, and Anne, who wrote several novels, they published as the Bell Brothers. And when it was discovered, when they were outed as women, they received intense criticism as being against God and society and civilization, basically. As with all the other results of the fall, sickness and death, pain and childbirth, alienation from nature and work, thorns, thistles, and weeds in the garden, the appropriate human response is not resignation, but resistance and working positively for redemption in male-female relationships. Genesis 3:16 explains the origin of the abuse of gender difference that feminists have documented in one form or another in every known culture. It explains the origin of patriarchy. But wonderfully, the biblical story does not end with the fall and its consequences. The gospel of Jesus Christ is very good news because it reconciles us to our Creator and provides hope for healing all the other alienations introduced at the fall, including gender relations. I don't have time to talk about the Old Testament, but if you want to raise a discussion, please do. I'm just going to jump to Jesus the Messiah. He challenged the gender norms of his culture. Jesus came into a world where in law and life, women were treated as inferior to men in virtually every way. Jewish rabbis did not have female disciples, and rabbinic writings even included some dire warnings against teaching women the law of God. It was believed that women's presence would distract the men from their studies, since women were by nature responsible for male lust. Jesus put the blame where it belonged, on the men who looked lustfully at women. Jesus included women in his traveling band of disciples and called them to the same discipleship as the men. While eating in the home of his good friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he rebuked Martha for her preoccupation with women's work, cooking and serving the men. And he praised Mary for sitting at his feet with the male disciples. Now, you may not realize it, but the phrase to sit at the feet of a rabbi was a technical phrase for theological study. It's the same phrase Paul used to describe his rabbinic training at the feet of Gamaliel. I think what's going on here is that Mary saw herself as a disciple of Jesus before anything else. That was the center of her identity. And she knew that at that moment, with Jesus in her home, the place to be was with all the disciples sitting at his feet and learning and listening to him. On that particular occasion, Martha's identity was too much in her role as a first-century Jewish woman, and only not enough in her role as a disciple of Jesus, or her calling as a disciple. On another occasion, a Jewish woman cried out to him, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breasts that nursed you." She was expressing her culture's equation of womanhood with motherhood. A woman's greatest blessing was to be the mother of sons, especially the mother of rabbis. Without putting down motherhood, Jesus expanded her definition of womanhood. He replied, "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and do it." Think about that. Because in fact, that is exactly what his mother Mary did. When she might have been 14 or 15 years old. He's saying, that's my mother's blessing. And it's a blessing accessible to any believer who follows her example of obedient discipleship. Mary, as a teenager, agreed to bear God's son out of wedlock without her father or her fiancé's permission. At the risk of being divorced or stoned to death, she replied, "Here I am. Let it be to me according to your word." Jesus taught that blessing, the blessing of Mary, is accessible to whoever follows her example of obedient discipleship, whether they're women, men, young, old, married, fathers, mothers, or childless. The view held by some evangelicals today that, quote, "the essence of womanhood is motherhood," unquote, is not unlike the definition of womanhood that Jesus challenged. According to Jewish and Roman law, women were considered too unreliable to give testimony in court. So it is highly significant that Jesus chose a woman to be the first witness of his resurrection and sent her to proclaim the news to the brothers. No one would have made that up. Would not have occurred to anyone to make up that story. Witnessing the risen Lord conferred a unique authority in the early church, a fact that was not lost on the Romans, who scorned the Christian faith for the authority that it recognized and invested in women. Jesus turned the world's ideas about power and greatness on their head, teaching often that the first will be last and the last will be first. Dorothy Sayers wrote this about Jesus of Nazareth. Perhaps it is no wonder that women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronized, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them either as the women God help us or the ladies God bless them, who rebuked without prayerlessness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend. He took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. There's no act, no sermon, no parable in the whole gospel that borrows its pungency from female perversity. Nobody could possibly guess from the words and deeds of Jesus that there was anything funny about woman's nature. Close quote. Briefly, just running on now to look at the church. Think of the early church. The Apostle Peter announced the birth of the church with an inaugural proclamation from the prophet Joel. Now that the Messiah had reconciled God and humanity, the Spirit of God was poured out on all flesh, removing gender, class, racial, and age barriers to ministry. At Pentecost, the sign of membership in the community of God's people changed from circumcision, exclusively male sign, to baptism. The inclusiveness of this sign is underscored in a very early baptismal formula. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And in the New Testament, equal status before God had dramatic, countercultural social implications in the life of the church. The church formed an unnatural unity of diverse groups who, outside of Christ, were in conflict with each other. And the inclusiveness and love among the early Christians, though not perfect, was so real and dramatic that some Romans called Christians the third race. Women went from silence to teaching and leadership. Slaves became deacons and bishops. Wealthy Christians willingly shared their property with the poor. Jews and Gentiles shared the Lord's Supper together. The all-male priesthood gave way to the priesthood of all believers, with Christ as the one high priest. And the New Testament includes examples of women prophets, teachers, leaders and ministers, a church overseer, and the female apostle Junia, who was praised by a number of early church fathers, including John Chrysostom, who wrote, "Indeed, how great the wisdom of this woman must have been, that she was even deemed worthy of the title of an outstanding apostle." Biased translations obscure some of this evidence. For example, Junia, the female apostle, was turned into a fabricated male name by a 14th century Latin commentator against all textual evidence. And one Bible paraphrase calls Phoebe a dear Christian woman, whereas in the original language she's called a leader or governor and a minister, gospel minister. Some English translations of two texts appear to prohibit women's teaching and authority in the church. In 1 Corinthians 14:33-35 and 1 Timothy 2:12-15. But both those problems are riddle both of those texts. The meanings of several critical Greek words are unclear. Both texts are in letters to churches struggling with specific problems with women, and both churches included respected women leaders. It's a serious mistake to use such problem texts to ban women from leadership when so much clearer biblical evidence affirms their teaching and leadership. In stark contrast to Aristotle, neither Christian virtues nor spiritual gifts are sex differentiated. All believers are called to imitate Christ, to put on the same armor of God, and to grow in the same fruit of the Spirit. The marriage relationship was radically equalized. It changed from a model of one-sided male rule to the mutual submission of servant leadership, a wife submitting to a husband who was to model Christ by loving her enough to submit to death for her. And mutual authority, husbands and wives having exactly the same authority over their own and each other's bodies. Paul also did away with the double sexual standard that was part of law and life in the first century Roman world. In the New Testament, the watershed for vocational freedom is marriage, not gender. Paul writes that single women and single men have exactly the same vocational freedom to serve Christ without the distractions of family life. But when a woman or man marries, both equally forfeit some of their vocational freedom out of service to their spouse and family. This is no satellite model of marriage with the wife's job to orbit around her husband, serving him to make sure that he can follow his vocation. In both Old and New Testaments, the nurture of children is described as the equal responsibility of both parents. It wasn't until the 19th century that the mother was first understood to be the primary caretaker of children as part of the Victorian cult of true womanhood. In God's wisdom, his word allows freedom and flexibility for husbands and wives, fathers and mothers to share work and parenting in a great variety of ways, depending on our gifts, our needs, our culture, and our place in the human life cycle. Furthermore, Scripture repeatedly warns against the equal dangers of both adding to it and subtracting from God's word. So we have to be really careful not to add rules and regulations about gender, work, and parenting that are not in Scripture. Let's thank God for the freedom he encourages. Life in an unpredictable, fallen world is hard enough without adding rules that make it even harder. The silences in his word may frustrate us at times, but they are there to bless us. They allow individuals and families the freedom we need to adapt to changing circumstances without calling into question our gender identity. It's no wonder that slaves and women of all classes were converted to the Christian faith in far greater numbers than were free Roman males. For they received dignity, authority, liberty, and justice in the church that was denied them in the culture. Whereas following Christ for men meant giving up many of their rights and privileges under Roman law. In conclusion, we should thank God that he wants liberty and justice for women. The gospel of Jesus Christ is equally good news for women and men, including for feminists. If you have friends, neighbors, colleagues, daughters, or granddaughters who identify as feminists, then please don't stereotype them. We all hate to be stereotyped. Rather, ask them what that means to them. What does it mean to them that they call themselves feminists? Listen to them. Read their books. Look for points of contact and agreement, and pray for the opportunity to share Jesus with them. Remember that many non-Christian feminists grew up in Christian homes and churches where they were treated as second-class citizens or worse, simply because they were female. They need to experience Christians and churches as attractive and affirming of them and of their gifts. They may need to be convinced that God and the Bible are not sexist, and you may need to do some homework to help them. My talk is centered on the American story, but I urge you to educate yourselves on the global problem of violence against women. In her book, Scars Across Humanity, Understanding and Overcoming Violence Against Women, the Christian scholar Elaine Storkey offers a thoroughly researched overview of a global crisis, including sex-selective abortions and infanticide of girl babies, which has led to massive gender imbalances. For example, in 2018, there were 33 million more men than women in China. In India and China, there simply are not enough women for the men to marry, which has led to bride kidnappings, coerced marriages, rape and trafficking of underage girls. Honor killings, female genital mutilation, child brides, and domestic violence are global problems. And many women continue to be denied freedom and justice in America, where sexual assault happens every 92 seconds. Most of the victims are women, and most victims of intimate partner homicide are also women, 2,237 in 2017. Human trafficking and increasingly violent child pornography are overlapping huge money-making industries, crimes in America, and most victims are girls and women. On May 28, 2019, PBS Frontline aired a very disturbing program on sex trafficking in America. I urge you to look at it. There's a huge market for sex with underage girls in Phoenix, Arizona, and many other American cities. It's centered on Phoenix, but especially during events like the Super Bowl, which draws many customers. These are disturbing realities which Christians should know about and work toward ending. In Scars Across Humanity, Storky includes resources and organizations committed to fighting the abuse of women, including the organization International Justice Mission, started by Gary Haugen. There's her book and then another one on women abuse in the Bible. Finally, my final paragraph. I must end by thanking God for our sure and final hope of a new heaven and a new earth where all people will experience liberty and justice, and all redeemed sinners will be welcome, for none of us stands as guiltless before a just and holy God. We all need forgiveness and reconciliation with God and with our fellow humans. Praise God that this is available to us through our Savior, Jesus Christ, and we can look forward to an eternity in God's kingdom of shalom, peace, justice, beauty, and righteousness. So I want to end by saying, come, Lord Jesus, come.
Yes.